In 2024, a single county in America, just 22.8 square miles of rock and landfill, produced a gross domestic product of $1 trillion. Not a state, not a metro area, one county. New York County, which is to say, the island of Manhattan. That number is larger than the entire economic output of the Netherlands or Saudi Arabia, and it was generated on an island that for most of its history was one of the most violent, disease-ridden, fire-prone, riot-scarred pieces of ground in the Western Hemisphere. A place where cholera epidemics killed thousands, where mobs burned orphanages and lynched men in the streets, where an entire financial district was incinerated in a single night and the fire hoses froze solid. The story of Manhattan is not the story of a place that was dangerous and then became rich. It is the story of a place where the danger and the wealth were always the same thing, where the very forces that made the island lethal are the ones that made it invaluable. But to understand any of it, you have to start with what's underneath. Manhattan sits on a spine of ancient metamorphic rock called Manhattan schist, formed roughly 450 million years ago. It is among the hardest, densest bedrock on Earth, strong enough to anchor buildings that weigh hundreds of thousands of tons. The Lenape people, who had lived on the island for thousands of years before any European set foot there, called it Mannahatta, which likely translates to something like hilly island. They were describing what the schist had made, a landscape of ridges and outcroppings, of rocky high ground falling steeply to tidal flats, surrounded on all sides by deep, fast-moving water. The island was narrow, barely 2 miles wide at its broadest, and the rivers that enclosed it were treacherous. It was, by nature, a fortress. And fortresses attract people who want to control things. The first European to see the island was probably the Florentine explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, who sailed into the harbor in 1524 and noted the abundance of wildlife, the deep natural port, and the Lenape watching him from shore. 85 years later, in 1609, Henry Hudson arrived on behalf of the Dutch East India Company, looking for a passage to Asia. He didn't find one. But he found something arguably more valuable for his employers: beavers, immense numbers of them. Beaver fur was the engine of European fashion in the early 17th century, and the pelts the Lenape could supply were of superb quality. Within a few years, Dutch traders had established a permanent foothold on the southern tip of the island. Then, in 1626, a transaction took place that would become the founding myth of American real estate. Peter Minuit, the director of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, reportedly purchased the island of Manhattan from a group of Native Americans for 60 guilders worth of trade goods. The story has been told for 400 years as a swindle, the Dutch buying Manhattan for $24. But almost nothing about the traditional version holds up. The only primary source is a single letter by a Dutch merchant named Peter Schagen, which mentions the exchange in one sentence, without specifying the date, the tribe, or the terms. Historians aren't even certain which group Minuit dealt with. Some evidence suggests it may have been the Canarsie, a Lenape band from Brooklyn, who accepted payment for land they didn't primarily occupy, making the deal less a swindle than a piece of sharp negotiating by the sellers. The Lenape, for their part, almost certainly didn't understand the transaction as a permanent sale. They had no concept of exclusive land ownership in the European sense. They likely saw the exchange as a gift of good faith, an agreement to share. The Dutch, however, saw a deed, and they built accordingly. By the 1640s, New Amsterdam was a small, rough settlement of a few hundred people clustered at the island's southern tip, surrounded on the landward side by a wooden palisade wall. That wall, built partly by enslaved Africans, intended to keep out both the Lenape and the English, ran roughly along the line of a street that would eventually carry the name Wall Street. A Lenape trade path called the Witwatersrand Trail wound up the island's spine. The Dutch widened it into a road they called Breedeweg. We know it as Broadway. By 1664, New Amsterdam was home to about 1,500 people speaking an estimated 18 languages. It was already a polyglot trading post, not a community in any settled sense. Then, in September of that year, 4 English warships appeared in the harbor, and Director General Peter Stuyvesant, short on soldiers, short on gunpowder, short on support from his own colonists, surrendered without a fight. The English renamed the place New York, after the Duke of York, and the commercial character of the island didn't change at all. If anything, it intensified. The English brought more formalized banking, more organized trade networks, and more people. By the time of the American Revolution, Manhattan's population had reached roughly 25,000, and it was already the second largest city in the colonies, behind Philadelphia. The war nearly destroyed it. The British occupied Manhattan for almost the entire conflict from 1776 to 1783, and 2 devastating fires, one in September 1776, the other in August 1778, burned roughly a quarter of the buildings on the island. Thousands of residents had fled. The ones who remained lived under martial law. When the British finally evacuated on November 25, 1783, a date long celebrated in New York as Evacuation Day, they left behind a battered, half-depopulated city. It recovered with a speed that still startles historians. Within 6 years, New York was the nation's first capital under the new Constitution. George Washington took the oath of office at Federal Hall on Wall Street on April 30th, 1789. The Supreme Court held its first session there. The Bill of Rights was drafted there. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, deliberately structured the new nation's financial system to funnel capital through New York, establishing the first bank of the United States, assuming state debts, and creating the institutional architecture that would make Wall Street the gravitational center of American money. On May 17, 1792, 24 stockbrokers and merchants gathered under a buttonwood tree at 68 Wall Street and signed an agreement to trade securities only among themselves and to charge fixed commissions. That agreement, 2 sentences long, scratched out on a scrap of paper beneath a tree, became the New York Stock Exchange. By 1810, Manhattan had surpassed Philadelphia as the most populous city in the country. But the event that truly transformed Manhattan, more than the Revolution, more than the Constitution, more than Hamilton's banking system, was a ditch. 363 miles of it, dug through the wilderness of upstate New York. The Erie Canal opened on October 26, 1825. Governor DeWitt Clinton rode a flotilla from Buffalo to New York Harbor over 10 days, and at the journey's end poured a keg of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic, the ceremonial wedding of the waters. The canal had cost $7 million and taken 8 years to build, and people had called it Clinton's Folly. Within a single year, toll revenue covered the entire construction debt. The canal cut the cost of shipping a ton of freight from Buffalo to New York from roughly $100 to less than $10, and it cut the transit time from 3 weeks to 8 days. Suddenly, everything that grew or was dug out of the ground in the American Midwest, grain, timber, iron, furs, flowed downriver and through the canal to Manhattan's piers. And everything manufactured in Europe or on the eastern seaboard flowed back the other way. New York went from the 7th largest port in America in the 1790s to the largest by 1830. When the canal opened, gross business in the city increased by $6 million almost overnight. 500 new commercial ventures appeared in the first few months. The canal didn't just enrich Manhattan. It remade the island's physical character. The waterfront exploded with wharves, warehouses, and sugar refineries. By the early 1830s, the narrow streets of Lower Manhattan, the old Dutch lanes never designed for this kind of traffic, had become the first business district in the world where commerce had completely displaced residential life. People didn't live downtown anymore. They worked there in counting houses and trading firms and insurance offices, and they went home to other parts of the island when the day was done. This was new, No city on earth had done it before. But the wealth pouring through Manhattan was unevenly distributed in ways that would have consequences measured in blood. The same harbor that received the canal's bounty also received ships packed with immigrants, Irish, German, later Italian, Jewish, Chinese, arriving by the hundreds of thousands, desperate, destitute, and willing to live in conditions that beggared description. And nowhere were those conditions worse than in a few blocks of lower Manhattan known as the 5 Points. The 5 Points, named for the intersection of 5 streets near what is now Chinatown, sat on the worst possible ground. It had been built on top of the Collect Pond, a freshwater lake that by the late 1700s had become so polluted by the tanneries and slaughterhouses on its banks that the city decided to drain it and fill it in. They did a terrible job. The fill settled unevenly, the ground stayed swampy, and the buildings erected on top began sinking almost as soon as they were finished. By the 1830s, the 5 Points was the most notorious slum in the Western Hemisphere. An old brewery on Cross Street, converted into a tenement, reportedly housed 1,000 people in rooms that had no ventilation and no light. Urban legend held that the building averaged a murder a night for 15 years. That figure is almost certainly exaggerated, but historian Tyler Anbinder, who wrote the definitive history of the neighborhood, confirmed that police records show nearly every building radiating from the intersection housed a brothel in the 1840s and 1850s. Charles Dickens visited in 1842, guided by police escort, and concluded that 5 Points contained every bit as much misery as the worst slums of London. His account made the neighborhood internationally famous and spawned the minor industry of slumming parties, wealthy New Yorkers paying to be escorted through the district to gawk at its squalor, a practice so common that the word slumming may have been coined there. The Swedish writer Fredrika Bremer, after inspecting the neighborhood carefully, wrote that lower than to the 5 Points it is not possible for human nature to sink. What gets lost in the horror stories is that the 5 Points was also, in its grim way, one of the most culturally generative places in America. It was one of the few neighborhoods where Irish immigrants and free black New Yorkers lived side by side, sharing dance halls and saloons. Cultural historians believe tap dancing was invented there, a fusion of Irish jig steps and African rhythmic dance. Tammany Hall, the political machine that would dominate New York City for generations, drew its first real power from 5 Points ward bosses who delivered immigrant votes in exchange for patronage and protection. The neighborhood was an incubator of American urban politics, American popular entertainment, and American organized crime, often in the same room, often run by the same people. And then, in the summer of 1863, the island erupted. On July 13th, 2 days after the federal government began enforcing the first military draft in American history, mobs poured into the streets of Manhattan. The Conscription Act had a clause that enraged the city's working poor. Any man who could pay $300, roughly a year's wages for a laborer, could buy his way out of service. The Irish neighborhood saw the draft as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. But what began as a protest against conscription turned within hours into a race riot. Mobs attacked black men in the streets, beat and lynched them with appalling brutality. They burned the Colored Orphan Asylum on Fifth Avenue, a 4-story building housing more than 200 children, to the ground. They looted a Brooks Brothers store on Catherine Street that had been manufacturing Union Army uniforms. They destroyed rail lines, telegraph wires, and boat slips to prevent reinforcements from arriving. For 4 days, from July 13th to 16th, Lower Manhattan descended into what remains the deadliest civil disturbance in American history. The official death toll was 119, but many historians believe the real number was far higher. Some estimates reach into the hundreds. Property damage ran between $1 and $5 million. President Lincoln diverted regiments from Gettysburg, where soldiers had been dying to end slavery, to retake the streets of Manhattan. The city rebuilt. It always rebuilt. That is the rhythm of Manhattan, and it is worth sitting with, because it explains more about the island than any single event. Fire, riot, epidemic, financial panic, the island absorbed each catastrophe and responded not with modesty, but with escalation. The Great Fire of December 16, 1835, is the clearest example. That night, in temperatures that fell to 17 below zero, a fire broke out in a warehouse near Wall Street. Gale-force winds drove the flames through the narrow downtown streets. The rivers were frozen. Firefighters drilled through the ice of the East River to reach water, and the water froze in their hoses. They didn't have enough gunpowder in Manhattan to blow up buildings and create a fire break. Marines had to row over to the Brooklyn Navy Yard at 3 in the morning to bring back kegs of powder. By the time the fire burned itself out, 674 buildings were gone. The Merchants Exchange, the post office, churches, banks, warehouses. The damage was estimated at $20 million, equivalent to roughly $600 million today. It was the worst urban fire in American history to that point. The city's response was not to scale back. It was to ban wooden construction in Lower Manhattan, require fire-resistant materials, and build the Croton Aqueduct, a 41-mile water system that brought fresh water from Westchester County, ending the island's dependence on frozen rivers and shallow wells. The city that emerged from the ashes of 1835 was made of stone and brick and iron. It was harder, denser, more expensive, and more permanently built than the wooden city it replaced. As one observer wrote at the time, New York rose again like a phoenix from her ashes. That metaphor has been applied to Manhattan so many times that it has become a cliché. But the reason it keeps getting used is that it keeps being accurate. Consider the sequence. The Erie Canal made Manhattan the nation's commercial capital. The Great Fire forced it to rebuild in fireproof materials that could support greater height and density. The waves of immigration that filled the 5 Points also filled the labor force that built the docks, dug the foundations, laid the rails, and ran the factories. Every crisis generated the conditions for the next expansion, and every expansion needed someone to manage the chaos. That someone, for the better part of 70 years, was Tammany Hall. The Democratic political machine, headquartered in a building on East 14th Street, ran Manhattan through a system of ward bosses, patronage jobs, and strategic graft that was breathtaking in its efficiency and its corruption. Its most infamous leader, William Boss Tweed, controlled New York City politics in the 1860s and early 1870s with a ring that stole an estimated $30 to $200 million from the public treasury. The range is that wide because the accounting was deliberately designed to make precise figures impossible. Tweed's courthouse on Chambers Street, originally budgeted at $250,000, ended up costing over $12 million. A single plasterer submitted bills for $9 million. When Tweed was finally brought down by Thomas Nast's devastating cartoons in Harper's Weekly and by an investigation led by Samuel Tilden, he died in a jail cell in 1878. But the machine outlived him by decades. Tammany understood something essential about Manhattan. In a city of immigrants, the man who helped you find a job, post bail, or get your street paved was the man who got your vote. It was transactional democracy, corrupt and indispensable. The Gilded Age that followed the Civil War turned Manhattan into a stage for the most extravagant displays of private wealth America had ever seen. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Carnegies built mansions along Fifth Avenue that rivaled European palaces. Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as the Mrs. Astor, held court in a ballroom at 350 Fifth Avenue that could hold exactly 400 people, a number that became the definition of New York high society. Her ballroom would eventually be demolished. An office building would rise on the same lot. That building would be the Empire State Building. By the middle of the 19th century, Manhattan's leaders faced a paradox that would define the island's character for the next century and a half. The place was making more money than anywhere in the country, and it was running out of room. The island is roughly 13 miles long and 2 miles wide. You cannot make it bigger. And so two things happened simultaneously. Manhattan pushed north, and Manhattan pushed up. The push north was codified in 1811, when the state legislature adopted the Commissioner's Plan, a grid of 12 north-south avenues and 155 east-west streets laid over the entire island from Houston Street to the northern tip. It was the most ambitious urban planning document in American history, and it was executed with a ruthlessness that flattened hills, filled ravines, obliterated farms, and erased every trace of the island's natural topography. The grid made every block interchangeable and every lot saleable. It was, fundamentally, a real estate document, a machine for converting wilderness into property. Central Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux and opened in 1858, was carved out of 843 acres in the middle of the grid, a deliberate concession that the island needed at least one large piece of ground that would not be built upon, or the density would become intolerable. The Brooklyn Bridge, which opened on May 24, 1883, after 14 years of construction and the deaths of at least 20 workers, announced the shape of things to come. Its towers rose 275 feet above the East River, 7 times higher than the 4-story skyline of Manhattan. When the lights were switched on across its steel suspension cables that spring evening, New Yorkers were seeing 2 technologies that would define their island's future: electricity and structural steel. The bridge's designer, John Augustus Roebling, died of tetanus before construction began, after his foot was crushed in an accident at the building site. His son, Washington Roebling, took over and was crippled by decompression sickness from working in the bridge's underwater caissons. He spent the remaining years of construction watching from his apartment window in Brooklyn Heights through a telescope, relaying instructions through his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, who effectively managed the project. Emily was the first person to cross the completed bridge. The bridge cost $15.5 million, roughly $500 million today, and it connected Manhattan to Brooklyn in a way that changed both places permanently, making the island's economy accessible to hundreds of thousands of new workers. The push upward began with the elevator and the steel frame. In 1870, the Equitable Life Assurance Building on Broadway became the first office building in New York with a passenger elevator. Within a decade, elevators had transformed the economics of Manhattan real estate. A lot that could support a 5-story building worth a certain amount could now support a 10-story building worth twice as much. The same bedrock that had given the island its hills, that Manhattan schist, 450 million years old, turned out to be the perfect foundation for towers of steel and stone. The rock was so strong that engineers could drive pilings straight down into it without fear of shifting or settling. Manhattan's geology, which had given the Lenape their hilly island, now gave developers their skyscrapers. Meanwhile, the push north required its own engineering miracle. On October 27, 1904, the first subway line opened in Manhattan, running from City Hall to 145th Street in Harlem. Over 100,000 people rode it on its first day. The fare was a nickel. Before the subway, the only way to move up and down the island was on surface streets, by horse, by streetcar, by the elevated railroads that rattled above 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 9th Avenues. The subway collapsed distance. A worker in a lower Manhattan factory could now live in upper Manhattan or the outer boroughs and commute in minutes. The population of Manhattan could spread out without the island's economic activity dispersing. The subway made the skyscraper possible in practical terms. You could stack 40,000 workers into a few square blocks of Midtown only if you had a way to move them in and out each day without the streets grinding to a halt. The race upward accelerated after the turn of the century. The Flatiron Building went up in 1902, 22 stories, 285 feet, shaped like a clothing iron at the intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue. The Singer Building followed in 1908 at 612 feet. The Metropolitan Life Tower topped out at 700 feet in 1909. Then Frank Woolworth, the five-and-dime magnate, hired architect Cass Gilbert to build what would become the Cathedral of Commerce at 233 Broadway. The Woolworth Building opened in 1913 at 792 feet and 57 stories. Woolworth paid the entire $13.5 million cost in cash. No mortgage, no bond issue. It remained the tallest building in the world for 17 years. But the race that defines Manhattan, the one people still talk about a century later, happened in 1929 and 1930, and it was driven by two automobile tycoons who couldn't stand the idea that the other man's building might be taller. Walter Chrysler, founder of the Chrysler Corporation, commissioned architect William Van Allen to build a tower at 405 Lexington Avenue. Simultaneously, the Bank of Manhattan Trust was putting up 40 Wall Street, designed by H. Craig Severance, who had been Van Allen's former business partner. The two men despised each other. As the buildings rose, each side kept revising the plans upward, trying to claim the title of world's tallest. Severance thought he had won when 40 Wall Street topped out at 927 feet. But Van Allen had a secret. Inside the crown of the Chrysler Building, workers had been assembling a 185-foot spire in sections hidden from view. On October 23, 1929, the day before Black Thursday, the stock market crash that began the Great Depression, the spire was hoisted through the top of the building and bolted into place. The Chrysler Building stood 1,046 feet tall. It had been the tallest building in the world for exactly the length of time it took a crane to lift a steel needle. The title lasted 11 months. On May 1, 1931, the Empire State Building opened at 1,250 feet and 102 stories. Its backer was John Jacob Raskob, a financial executive at DuPont and General Motors who couldn't let Walter Chrysler's building stand unchallenged. Construction had moved at an almost hallucinatory pace. 14 months from groundbreaking to completion, an average of 4.5 floors per week. The steel order alone, 57,480 tons, was the largest single order in history. Limestone came from Indiana, marble from Italy and France, granite from Sweden, wood from the Pacific Northwest. A small railway system ran through the basement, feeding materials to elevators that carried them to the working floors. While the Titans raced each other skyward, the industry that employed the most people on the island wasn't finance or construction. It was garments. By 1910, Manhattan's garment district, centered on 7th Avenue between 34th and 42nd Streets, employed hundreds of thousands of workers, mostly immigrant women, sewing shirts and dresses and coats in loft buildings that were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and frequently locked from the outside to prevent workers from taking breaks. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory near Washington Square on the top 3 floors of the Ash Building. The doors were locked. The fire escapes collapsed. Workers jumped from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors to their deaths on the sidewalk below. 146 people died, most of them young immigrant women, Italian and Jewish, between the ages of 14 and 23. The public outrage that followed the Triangle fire led directly to dozens of new labor laws, building codes, and factory inspections that reshaped American workplace safety. The building still stands. It is now part of New York University. The Empire State Building opened into the Depression. In its first year, only 23% of its office space was rented. New Yorkers called it the empty State Building. It didn't turn a profit from its rentals until 1950. But that fact, in a way, is the most Manhattan detail in this entire story. A building conceived in irrational optimism, built at insane speed, opened into economic catastrophe, unable to fill its own rooms for 2 decades, and still standing nearly a century later, still one of the most recognizable structures on Earth. its observation deck alone generating more revenue than many American companies. The building bet against the present and won against the future. That is a Manhattan specialty. The Depression and the Second World War slowed Manhattan but didn't diminish its centrality. The island served as the staging ground for wartime logistics, its harbor shipping men and materiel across the Atlantic. In 1949, the United Nations established its permanent headquarters on a stretch of the East River in Midtown, a gesture that confirmed what commerce had already established. Manhattan was not merely an American capital, but a global one. What almost killed the island was what came after, the post-war exodus. Between 1950 and 1980, hundreds of thousands of middle-class residents left Manhattan for the suburbs. Robert Moses, the master builder who controlled New York's public works for 4 decades, drove expressways through the outer boroughs and built bridges to Long Island and Westchester, making suburban commuting feasible. He never built a crosstown expressway through lower Manhattan. Jane Jacobs and community activists stopped him, but the damage was done by what he built everywhere else. The manufacturing sector that had employed millions, the garment shops, the printing houses, the food processing plants, left the island for cheaper space. Between 1960 and 1975, Manhattan lost roughly 500,000 manufacturing jobs. The waterfront, which had been the economic engine of the island since the Dutch, fell silent. Piers rotted. Warehouses emptied. By the mid-1970s, Manhattan was broke in a way that seemed terminal. In 1975, New York City came within hours of declaring bankruptcy. President Gerald Ford initially refused to authorize a federal bailout, prompting the legendary Daily News headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." Crime rates soared. Subway cars were covered in graffiti. Times Square devolved into a strip of pornographic theaters and drug dealers. The South Bronx burned. Central Park was widely considered unsafe after dark. The population of Manhattan dropped below 1.4 million, its lowest point in decades. Serious people, economists, urban planners, politicians, discussed whether large American cities were simply obsolete, relics of an industrial age that had ended. What happened next is not one thing. There is no single savior, no single policy, no single building that reversed Manhattan's decline. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling a simplification. What happened was a convergence. The financial industry deregulated and expanded. Wall Street's trading volume exploded in the 1980s, and the bonuses that flowed from it poured directly into Manhattan real estate. The crack epidemic, which devastated the outer boroughs, subsided in the early 1990s, and crime fell, dramatically, continuously, for reasons that criminologists still argue about. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's aggressive policing and Mayor Michael Bloomberg's business-friendly administration each played a role, though how much of one depends on who's talking. Times Square was redeveloped. The High Line, an abandoned elevated rail line on the west side, was converted into a public park and became a catalyst for billions of dollars in new construction. Hudson Yards rose on the far west side, an entire neighborhood built on a platform over an active rail yard, the largest private real estate development in American history. And the money that flowed into Manhattan was no longer just American. Foreign buyers from the Middle East, from Russia, from China, from Europe began purchasing Manhattan apartments not as homes, but as assets, safe deposit boxes made of glass and steel. In 2019, the hedge fund billionaire Ken Griffin paid $238 million for a penthouse at 220 Central Park South, the most expensive residential sale in American history. The building sits on a stretch of 57th Street that developers call Billionaire's Row, where slender, super-tall towers have reshaped the skyline in the last decade, their apartments priced so far above what any working New Yorker could afford that many of them sit empty for most of the year, their owners visiting perhaps a few weeks annually. The median sale price of a Manhattan home reached $1.4 million in early 2026. 60 to 65% of Manhattan real estate transactions are made in cash. The average price per square foot for a condominium broke $2,000. The numbers are staggering enough that they can feel abstract, so it is worth pausing on one. Manhattan's GDP, the total economic output of this single narrow island, reached $1 trillion in 2024. That is the highest total GDP and the highest GDP per capita of any county in the United States by a significant margin. Each workday, 1.6 million people commute onto the island from the outer boroughs, from New Jersey, from Connecticut, from Long Island, swelling the daytime population to nearly 4 million. They come because this is where the headquarters are. The banks, the law firms, the media companies, the advertising agencies, the stock exchanges. The New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, both headquartered on the island, are the two largest stock exchanges in the world by total market capitalization. Broadway shows sold over $1 billion in tickets in recent seasons. Over 60 million tourists visited in 2023. But the danger never fully left. It changed form. Manhattan was nearly destroyed by terrorism on September 11, 2001, when two hijacked airliners struck the twin towers of the World Trade Center, which had stood at the southern tip of the island since 1973. The North Tower, at 1,368 feet, once the tallest building in the world. Both towers collapsed within 102 minutes. The attacks killed 2,753 people in Lower Manhattan, obliterated 16 acres of the financial district, and filled the sky over the island with a cloud of ash and pulverized concrete that drifted south over the harbor for days. The island was the epicenter of the 2020 COVID-19 crisis, when refrigerated trucks lined the streets outside hospitals serving as makeshift morgues, and the population briefly dropped as remote work made the daily commute to Manhattan seem, for the first time in a century, optional. Office vacancy rates climbed. Predictions of Manhattan's obsolescence returned, as they always do, as they did in the 1970s, as they did after September 11th, as they did during every financial panic going back to 1837. Each time the island absorbed the blow and rebuilt, not because of some mystical resilience, but because of the same structural forces that have operated since the Erie Canal. Manhattan is valuable because it is dense. It is dense because the island is small. The island is small because it is bounded by water on every side. And the buildings can be as tall and as heavy as ambition demands, because underneath all of it, underneath Wall Street and Broadway and Central Park, underneath the subway tunnels and the water mains and the steam pipes and the fiber optic cables, sits the Manhattan schist, the same ancient metamorphic rock the Lenape walked across when the island was still called Mannahatta. The wall the Dutch built to keep out the Lenape is gone. The fur trading post is gone. The collect pond is gone, buried under courthouses and government offices. The 5 Points is gone, its intersection sealed beneath Columbus Park, where on any given afternoon you can watch people playing chess and practicing Tai Chi on ground that, in 1850, averaged a murder a week. The old brewery is gone. The colored orphan asylum is gone. The wooden city that burned in 1835 is gone. The empty state building is full. The Bedrock is still there. It has been there for 450 million years. It is the only thing on the island that hasn't been bought, sold, demolished, and replaced with something taller.